All right, I'm sorry, we got cut off on the last one. So part two is about determining like the voting qualifications. This is where I got left off on concurrent. So, like when we talked about like voter qualifications, and we were talking about some of the racist laws that have been imposed, like with the grandfather clause, the poll tax, the literacy test. This is how states were kind of skimming by on some of that stuff, and that's why we eventually had to do like the poll tax with the 28th Fourth Amendment, no poll tax, and why we had to do the Voting Rights Act, where we eliminated any like barriers or restrictions to voting. So this is one of those things that when you look at like voter qualifications, like your states right now are looking at like picture IDs. Same thing with some of your states, like with former felons, so like convicted felons. Can they vote? Can they not vote? And so you do have like a lot of people asking those questions about, is that a restriction? Is that a violation of like voting rights? But technically, your states have the right to determine voting qualifications, and states do conduct the election, but the federal government is sharing that determining voting qualifications, so they can always step in and say no or yes, this is okay. So this like pie chart is the federal proposed budget in 2018, and so like this large green part is like the defense spending. This is education, energy, and so you can just kind of see how the government is divvying out and spending the money. Okay, and so this would be the U.S. government. Now, North Carolina also has a budget because remember, they're getting to spend money, they're getting to bring in your taxes, and so every state spends their money a little bit different. Every state isn't going to use money on like defense. Probably their bigger portion would be like education. Okay. So the next thing when we look at concurrent would be like borrowing money. So both the federal government and the states can actually borrow money, so they can get loans, and they can get like interdepartment loans. There's a lot of like ways they can borrow money, and we're not going to get into all that. They also have the ability to provide for the general welfare. And so, like, when you provide for the general welfare, it could be health standards, it could be providing services. So, they have to provide for us. They also get the power to regulate banks. So, you have state qualifications on banks and you have federal. Okay, so your banks that operate within your state are definitely going to get regulated by both the state and the federal government. Same thing like with Bank of America. That's a huge corporation. It's regulated within the states that it operates, but it's also regulated by the federal government. You also, both for federal and state, they have the ability to claim property for public use. So when we look at that one, that would be like eminent domain in that Fifth Amendment. So this is where you see some communities talking about the how like some of the inner city areas are getting taken, and they're getting taken for like public use now. They're getting taken to build some maybe expensive place right there and things like that. So this would be like gentrification that you're seeing going on in some of the cities, and it could also be for like roads. So when we're first building cities and towns and stuff, we're not really thinking of where we're building stuff. And now that cities have popped up and towns have popped up, you might need to build a road there. And unfortunately, there's a house there. And so that's where they use eminent domain. But remember, if the government takes your property, they have to give you just compensation. So they can't just claim it, they have to also give a person the right to, of course, due process. They have the right to appeal it, but they also have to give you compensation. They have to give you financial compensation for taking your property. Both the federal government and states can charter banks and corporations, and what a charter is just the legal right to exist. Okay, so like universities have charters, so like they get them from the state that they operate in. Same thing with banks and companies. Both the federal and state governments also build roads. So they build our highways, they build our interstates, They build our roads, and that's how you and I can help out with commerce, trade. It's how you and I get to our jobs, our economy. The next one that we're going to look at is implied. And implied powers are a little bit tricky because in implied powers, the federal government is going to take a delegated power that they actually have, and they're going to use it to kind of create something different. So this is the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. So this is that flexibility. So like on the other ones, we're kind of really looking at a lot of federalism, but implied powers is still a part of federalism, but it's also a part of that flexibility that we look at with the principles. So when you look at implied here with the elastic clause, it's not that they can do anything and everything they want. It's what is necessary and proper to carry out a delegated power. So, like coining money, that's a power that's actually written. War is written, so how can you take that word and kind of shoot off from it more powers? So, like the creation of the cabinet. So, the president is supposed to enforce laws, he's supposed to protect us. So as time went on, the first president he created his cabinet, and the cabinet is just a group of advisors to the president, and they're supposed to be experts on certain topics. So in the 1970s, we're having an energy crisis, oil embargo, things are bad in the country, and so we create the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy, because they got to keep us safe, our well-being, they're supposed to look at like alternative fuel sources. So this is when we started kind of looking at like green energy. It's when they started looking at other things going on, because there was some nuclear stuff going on, just a lot of stuff going on, and so finally we created a Department of Energy. Your more recent department that had been created was the Department of Homeland Security. So in Homeland Security, what you see is like after 9/11, we felt that we needed to change how we do our defense system. We were really focused on defending us, like military-wise, and we were looking more like at foreign wars and stuff like that. But how do you protect homeland? How do you protect the United States itself? And so we created the Department of Homeland Security, and that was a big overhaul to our airports and everything. I mean, trade, the cargo ships coming in, all that stuff coming in kind of changed. The next thing that we're going to look at with implied is like the use of the Commerce Clause. So in the United States Constitution, the government has the Commerce Clause. They have the power to regulate our trade. So one of the things that the federal government did as time went on, they created a federal minimum wage. So the federal government sets the minimum wage. States are allowed to adjust it up. They cannot adjust it down. So if your state wants to go ahead and do $15 an hour, they can do that because that's higher than the federal minimum wage. They just can't make it lower. So this was a bad time in America. We created a minimum wage. This is the least amount of money you can pay workers. Same thing with like common defense. So like in the government, in the Constitution, it says the government's supposed to provide for our common defense. Well, as time went on, we started drafting soldiers. So in the Civil War, there was a draft. You saw a draft in World War I, World War II, Vietnam. So if you didn't have enough active duty soldiers who are already signed up, you could draft soldiers. So that's like the Selective Service Act. Same thing would provide for well-being. So in our our Constitution, it says the government is supposed to provide for our well-being. Well, what does well-being mean? Okay, so we created universal health care. We started thinking of it as a right that people need to have, that, if you get sick, you should be able to go to a doctor. So this is implied powers. So what they took was the word well-being, and they're like, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? And as time went on, it meant universal health care. Same thing with common defense. Well, what does that mean? It means draft. It could mean creating a new branch of the military. Okay, so originally we had the Army, and then we create the Navy, and as time has gone on, we've created the other parts of our United States Armed Forces. Same thing with Commerce Clause. The government does a little bit more than just minimum wage now. Like there's safety standards. So there's a lot more that the government does, but they have to use a delegated power. They can't just pop words off the top of their head and create things. So if you got a large vocabulary, you could probably create a little bit more. So like when they created a Department of Energy, it was the time when we were having a lot of problems, but they had done it in the past. They had created departments, so they can do it again. It wasn't anything ruled illegal by the Supreme Court on it. So I hope this helps you understand the powers a little bit better. And I hope that you learned something, you took something away.